Council agenda, Township of Parsippany-Troy Hills, regular Township Council meeting of August 20th, 2019.
Posting of notice. Adequate notice of this meeting has been provided in accordance with the requirements of the Open Public Meetings Law by filing the notice in the office of Township Clerk and by posting the meeting notice on the bulletin board at the Municipal Building on December 19th, 2018, which has remained posted since that date. A legal notice appeared in the Daily Record and the Newark Star Ledger on December 27, 2018, and was forwarded by fax to other local newspapers and local radio stations on December 19, 2018. Council meetings are videotaped and aired on Public Access Channel 21 at 7 p.m. Sundays and Wednesdays, and are also available for viewing at www.parsippany.net.
Please rise for the flag salute.
Yeah.
Peterson, if you would.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Mr. DePiero?
Here.
Ms. Grignani?
Present.
Ms. McCarthy?
Here.
Ms. Peterson?
Here.
Mr. Carriffy?
Here.
Also in attendance are Mayor Michael Soriano, Township Attorney Jim Lott, CFO Ann Cucci, Township Clerk Colette Madden, Council President. You have a quorum. You may begin.
Thank you. Upcoming meetings, September 3rd, 7 p.m. agenda meeting. September 17th, 7 p.m. regular meeting. Approval of minutes, presentations, reports. Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Council President. Two points to just cover today. The first is an announcement for upcoming date. 8:30 in the morning on September 11th, we will have a remembrance for those in Parsippany who lost their lives on that horrible day so long ago. Here at Town Hall, we'll be doing it on the side where the actually it's over on this side, on this side where we have the 3 new flagpoles for that. But I think it's the right way to start the day, especially that's exactly 8:45 is the time the first plane hit. So everyone is invited, everyone here. So there'll be emails and posts about that as well, but everyone's invited to be there for it. Second, for my second part of my report, I would like to call up Chief Dean Snook to give me an assist on this. Chief? Take that mic right there.
Should we put that back?
Yeah. Speak into the microphone. Come on. Oh. All right. You want to start? Or you want me to? You go. All right. Good evening, everybody. We will try to make this quick. I know everybody's time is valuable, and it's very hot out tonight. We have a very positive presentation tonight. As I described it earlier, it shows as if it was a training video being filmed as to how the emergency response system is supposed to work in a cardiac event, from the community's partnership with the folks in our community helping before we can get there as emergency services, right through to the hospital, and ultimately the discharge of the patient from the hospital. So just a kind of a quick summary of where we are with everything. On Saturday, May 4th of 2019, so a few months ago, and the scheduling logistics, we're here in August, so it's the summer, right? On May 4th in the morning, a gentleman here that's in the audience with us, Mr. John Starger, suffered a heart attack. He collapsed on the ground on Tabor Road, and the gentleman sitting to his right, John McCorsky, who was a former town resident, his family is still a town resident, happened to be driving by. Apparently he's a very nosy guy and looks all around when he drives, and he noticed that the other John was on the side of the road, essentially needed some assistance. He stopped, immediately started CPR. Just by chance, the person that called 911 was County Business Administrator John Benani, because he too just happened to be driving by. Shortly after, Ms. Kim Conklin, an off-duty nurse, she was driving by, so she stopped and assisted with CPR. And within 2 minutes of the 911 call, our ambulance was on the scene and a defibrillator was hooked up. So as many of you, I'm sure, have seen at some point in videos and TV ads and learned CPR, et cetera, it's part of the chain of survival. And this is truly a tribute to that community partnership that is essential for us as emergency services to have a favorable outcome, ultimately for the patient. So I had asked the mayor if we could consider recognizing, obviously, our Good Samaritans, our community members, as well as some of our emergency services workers, because while as EMTs and paramedics, this is our job to provide pre-hospital care. This is certainly a tribute to a unified response, and it emphasizes that importance of our community partnership when emergencies happen. We have a large town, we have a lot of resources, but there's never enough resources when it's your emergency because you want everybody there in a second. Sometimes it works out we're there in a second, sometimes it's 2 seconds. And we really appreciate the fact that our community members are so engaged and ready to help out whenever possible. So we have a couple people here tonight. The mayor's going to go through the actual award recipients, but just to do some brief introductions, there's not going to be a test on names, so no need to take notes. We're good. Mr. John Starger, who's our patient and our success story of the out-of-hospital care that he received, he's joined tonight by his wife, Victoria, and his son, Brett, and sister, Kathy. John McCorsky, who is our gentleman who started CPR right away. He's joined by his family. You said your mom, your dad, and I'm sorry, there's one other person. Your aunt, correct? I'm sorry, I couldn't read my handwriting that I messed up here as I tried to take attendance. And then tonight we also have Debbie Paglianite representing St. Clair's Health System paramedics. She's their educator. Unfortunately, the staff members that were working that day could not be here tonight due to a schedule conflict. I don't know. I got nothing. And then from Township EMS, we have Ryan Gray. He was one of our EMTs that was on the scene. He's joined tonight by his wife, Tila, his son, Hunter, and his mother and father-in-law, Marina and Walter. And the baby's sleeping? I don't want to wake the baby up. I know his wife, she scares me. And last but not least, EMT supervisor for Parsippany, Brandon Nostein, could not be here tonight due to a prior scheduling conflict. But I know that his wife Shannon, son Jack, and daughter Ava were very proud of him, and they had hoped to be here, but we had some scheduling conflicts trying to get everybody organized, because nobody has anything going on in the summer, right? But anyway, thank you guys very much, folks in the audience. Thank you for bearing with us for just a second. I'm going to turn it over to the mayor, and we'll get underway.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you very much. Okay. So, when I call your name, please come on up. John McCorsky. Stay over here too. Come on over here. Okay. Kim Conklin. She's not in? Okay, that's right. She's not with us today. We'll get that to her in her own way. Brandon Notstein, who couldn't be with us here today. Ryan Gray. Good. Come on over here. No, come on over here. Come on over here. And, you know, John Bonanni couldn't be here today, and quite frankly, when I called him about this, he's the county administrator. He's kind of like, you know, it's kind of, in some ways, he's like the mayor of the entire county in some ways, being the administrator. John is a humble public servant. Anyone that knows him really loves him and respects him, and he's a quiet guy, and he prefers to be behind the scenes, and really didn't want any accolades, but I'm going to embarrass him with this anyway. I'll probably have to barge into his office and give it to him. But yeah, well, we'll figure it out. I'll catch him. Elizabeth McDowell. She's on medics. Okay. And the last one, yes.
Probably her partner,
John Miller. Okay, couldn't be here either today. So, she's one. Counsel, do you want to come down and take a picture with her? Please, sure. Please come on down.
Oh, sure. Where's the gentleman, the patient? Where's the patient? Where's the patient?
Yeah, come on up.
Yes, exactly. He is the VIP.
Stand right here.
How are you? VIP.
Good to see you.
Dean, come on over here on this side. Balance out. Get on the far end of Mike and Janet should be between the two of you. Okay, very good. Yes, we then. the certificates, guys. There you go. Come on. Thank you. One more. This is for the press. When did you get certified CEO?
Right now, this is the guy that was training.
We've actually met a couple times.
He's sitting there, I'm like, I never read him.
Yeah.
I moved his chairs.
Sure.
I'm only up to lifting 3 pounds.
Oh, it's awesome. 3 more pounds than you were before.
3 pounds.
Mr. Council President, that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. These people a second to.
Good story.
Just told Jim.
What an
all the
amazing
stories.
great place right
Save
Yeah, everything was in place.
My dad was driving once and saw 2 kids in a boat flip over, and it was like just by like a miracle that he saw it happen, and he was able to get in the water and save them.
Yeah, other than all the you said, yes.
Okay, moving on. Township Council.
I have one item, please.
Okay.
We have a vacancy on the Environmental Committee, and I would like to nominate Michelle Gaynor.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do it this time, but going forward, we're going to require a little bit more information from them only, so this way we can communicate to them as to what they need. So we will go ahead and take this nomination.
She's here. We can communicate. Sorry,
Oh, Michelle?
That's my fault.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, then we need to nominate her. They didn't tell you they're not taking any more appointments? I'm kidding. I'm so kidding. But go ahead. Yes, we will do that. Now, I will speak to you on the side if I can just get your information, Ms. Gaynor, so I can get the... no, in a minute, yeah. All right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I go?
Yeah.
What do I say?
Nominate Michelle Gaynor to be on the Environmental Committee and to help out the clerk. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh,
Yeah.
I make a motion to nominate Michelle Gaynor to the Environmental Committee.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion by Ms. Peterson, a second by Ms. McCarthy to nominate Ms. Michelle Gaynor to the Environmental Committee. Roll call, Mr. DePiero.
Before I vote, do we have a spreadsheet yet?
We do have the spreadsheet, yes, and I'm also going to send an email, and I've sent an email in the past. I'll send it again about the appointments procedures and what we need to do going forward, so we have everybody's information on file, and we know all the vacancies and stuff.
I'm not opposed, only ongoing. We do have people that have submitted resumes requesting to be appointed to certain positions, and there is a spreadsheet now, and we should be paying attention to that spreadsheet instead of jumping people over others who have already requested. I have no a problem with this. I just like to make sure everybody understands for the future.
Totally
That's
understand.
how it should be.
So
done.
what we'll do is tomorrow you guys will get an email from me with the appointments procedures along with the spreadsheet and any other resumes that we may have on file that are awaiting appointments. So this
Okay.
way everybody has
I
the
vote yes.
information. Miss Grignani,
Yes.
Miss McCarthy,
Yes.
Miss Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Carriffy.
Yes.
Okay, congratulations, Ms. Gaynor.
Congratulations.
I have a few things, Paul.
Okay.
First of all, our BA is not here, so I assume we're not going to receive financials on Kemper.
I believe that was supposed to be a presentation for September?
September meeting?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hunting Ridge, that's the Condit property, the townhouses on Route 46 and Beverwick Road. and the Condit House, which is a historic site. The Hunting Ridge Association does not want to be responsible for the Condit House any longer and would like to turn that over to the township. I contacted Randy, and he said the Historic Committee would love to have control of the Condit House. I called Dan Cassis to see what we would need to do, and we would have to have a meets and bounds done so that we know the exact area of the property if we were going to receive it. And then the complication is the way that association was developed. Every single tenant in Hunting Ridge is a part owner of that building, which makes it complicated. The way around that would be for us to lease it for $1 a year for 99 years, and then with an option to renew, which makes it in perpetuity. And then the leadership, the association leadership, could then make that agreement. I'm asking the administration to look into it, the feasibility, the cost, and see if that's something we should do. Okay, I have one other item. I'm going to make this in the form of a motion, and I'm going to read it so I don't say anything out of context. After discussion with council members and a long time waiting, I am making a motion to direct the mayor to pay retired Captain James Carifi the accrued time of $405,000, days of unused sick, vacation, comp time, and personal days worth $368,482.02 owed to him in full plus interest to date. These monies had already been set aside by the township when Mr. Carifi retired. Therefore, there is no hardship or additional costs to the residents of Parsippany. I'm proposing that the payments shall be made in 3 equal payments with interest to date with each disbursement. The first payment shall be made within a week from the date of this council direction, with the following 2 on the anniversary. So we're not giving him all the money at once, we're giving to him 1/3 of it each year for 3 years. With adjusted interest rates at the time of payment. So therefore, I'm requesting that the Township of Parsippany-Troy Hills wishes to conduct an ministerial function of compensating Mr. Carifi for his unused time without any admission of liability or statement as to the position of either party regarding Mr. Carifi's separation from employment.
Second.
Council
If
President.
accepted, let me just finish, I have one more small paragraph. If accepted by former Officer Carifi, this payment will resolve all claims Mr. Carifi has to accrue days of unused sick, vacation, comp time, and personal days from the Township of Parsippany-Troy Hills.
Second.
Council President, I'd ask to be heard. Due to the nature of the motion, which I think is procedurally irregular, I would ask that we go into closed session to discuss this. We're currently in litigation with Mr. Carifi. I also don't believe it's appropriate to appropriate any money pursuant to a resolution. I think that has to be reduced in writing via resolution.
So at this time, there's a motion on the table and there's a second.
I would call for a vote.
Okay, so motion made by
This has been going on for years and years. I just want it to end.
Now, what you have, just so I can clarify this motion, you have something in writing so I can read it off, just
And
because.
I would again ask that we go into closed session to discuss the motion. It's not appropriate for this to be discussed at this point in time during open public
Loretta has a
session.
copy for you.
We are currently in litigation with Mr. Carifi.
Okay. Yeah, Carifi 1, Carifi 3.
I understand we
and
have
Carifi 4.
multiple litigations with Mr. Carifi. It's inappropriate for this motion to be considered by council.
But
Okay.
this portion is not under litigation.
So at this time, we had the township attorney make a request. It appears that the request has been denied. There's a motion on the table and a second. The motion here appears to be.
I'd like the clerk to note my objection for the record.
Okay, so I am noting the township attorney's objection for the record that the motion, Mr. Lott, I can't repeat exactly what you said, so.
I'd like to have my objection noted for the record. It's against my advice. I
Okay.
also don't believe the motion is appropriate.
So the motion is being made against the advice of counsel. At this time, we have a motion by Mr. DePiero, seconded by Ms. Grignani. The motion is to pay Captain James Carriffy the accrued time of $405,000 of unused sick, vacation comp, and personal days, plus interest to date. And also to make it in 3 equal installments with the accrued interest of those years as well. So now we're going into a roll call. Again, a motion was made by Mr. DePiero, seconded by Ms. Grignani. Roll call, Mr. DePiero?
Yes.
Ms. Grignani?
Yes.
Mr. Carriffy is recused on this matter. Ms. McCarthy?
Yes.
And Ms. Peterson?
I am going, can I abstain at the advice of our counsel?
You can abstain, absolutely. Are you
That's what I will do.
abstention? Okay, so we have 3 yes votes. There is 1 recusal and 1 abstention, so the motion passes.
That's all I have, Council President.
Okay.
I'll just note for the record that pursuant to NJSA 4069A-180, ordinances and resolutions are to be reduced in writing, either written or typewritten, and shall be read and considered as a matter of general law. That was not followed here. There was no resolution prepared for the public and for the council to consider.
Is that vote binding?
I,
Mr. Lott, in your opinion?
I'll reserve my legal opinion for closed session, Ms. Peterson.
Okay.
That's all I
okay,
have.
Township Attorney?
I'm going to cede most of my time to Ms. Favati, the township planner, in connection with a request we received in January from the owners of Lanadex Plaza, identified as Block 392, lots 1 and 2. The owners had requested that the Township Council consider the property as being in need of redevelopment pursuant to the redevelopment law. That request was referred to the Planning Board in late January of 2019. Subsequent to that referral, the Planning Board has prepared an investigation and held a public hearing and made a recommendation on July 22nd that the property is in need of redevelopment. The Planning Board adopted last night a resolution memorializing its findings. I'll remind Council that the ultimate redevelopment designation rests with the governing body, and what we have from Planning Board is a recommendation. And with that, I'll turn that over to Ms. Favati.
Is this on? It appears to be so. Good evening, Council President and council members. Good to be back. Good to see you all. Happy summer. I will try to be concise. Gave this presentation once before the Planning Board, so hopefully second time around is even better. Why are we here tonight? As Mr. Lott was introducing me, we're here because you, back in January, directed the Planning Board to undertake a study, an area in need of redevelopment study of Block 392, lots 1 and 2, Lanadex Plaza East, otherwise known as. And under the provisions of the New Jersey Local Redevelopment and Housing Law, the governing body has that authority. The Planning Board has the authority to undertake the study, and that was done basically between January and July. We led that study. We did a couple of site visits. I mean me, 2 different site visits. Reviewed the land use and zoning for the area, reviewed tax data, zoning permit data to get a sense of past development. We reviewed the occupancy and tenancy with the building owners to get a sense of the health of the office complex. We were also provided 2 different studies by the property owners. One was a market study done by the Otto Group, which is a well-regarded financial market analysis group here in New Jersey. The other was by Kimmerly Group, which is another well-regarded architecture firm, and they provided a lot of information about the building conditions, the site conditions, potential costs for rehabilitation, obviously supplemented with our own analysis as well. So under the provisions of the local redevelopment and housing law, once a designation for an area in need of redevelopment has occurred, that empowers municipalities to use a range of tools that are at your disposal to facilitate future revitalization of those properties. So on July 22nd, the Planning Board held a hearing on the study. They had received it in advance, and we went through the contents of the study, which I'm going to go through tonight as well. And the end result of that public hearing was that the Planning Board did make a recommendation to you that you designate this area as an area in need of redevelopment. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is really just for you to begin consideration of that recommendation. I know no one can read this. This is just a flow chart that kind of goes through the process of redevelopment, basically beginning with the first box, which was back in January when you gave direction to the Planning Board to undertake this study. Part of that resolution from the governing body does have to state whether or not condemnation or eminent domain is going to be considered. From the beginning, your resolution was very clear. This is a non-condemnation area in need of redevelopment study, so eminent domain is not on the table in this case. The Planning Board has to prepare a map as part of its study of the potential area that we're talking about, and that was contained in the study. Planning Board conducts the investigation, holds a public hearing, and gives a recommendation on the study. All of that occurred on July 22nd. The next step is it comes to you, and you may basically take the recommendation and make a decision that you think is appropriate. You may accept, you may deny, you may accept with modification. That's, as Township Attorney said, it's entirely in your purview. Once you've made that decision, if eminent domain is on the table, then you have to state some reasons, some justifications for that. That's, again, not on the table in this case, so that doesn't apply. Once the designation is in place, the township is empowered to undertake a redevelopment plan, which is under your purview, often in concert with the Planning Board. Once the redevelopment plan is in place, that may either replace the zoning for the site or may sort of overlay the zoning, give an option, different options to the property owner, and that's in place. And then once both the plan and the redevelopment designation are both in place, the municipality is empowered to undertake revitalization using various tools, which we could talk about. So in terms of the redevelopment area that we're talking about, this is the map that was contained in the study. It is 2 lots, if I can get the pointer to work. Yay. They total about 45 acres. It's off of Parsippany Road, basically right at the southwestern corner or intersection of Route 80 and Route 287. And these 2 lots had been under different ownership until about 2018. They were bought by a common owner for the first time really in decades, so bringing this entire complex under one owner. Looking at the land use for the area, as you can see, a lot of it is the pink, which is sort of office, commercial, corporate office type development, and that is in place not only for Land Index Plaza East, but also across Parsippany Road to Land Index Plaza West, as well as across the highway, along Jefferson Road, some of those properties over there. Other than that, a lot of the area is either commercial, as you can see along the Parsippany Road corridor. This is one of your prime commercial corridors here in Parsippany. And then the rest of the area, the immediate area, is solidly single-family residential. The zoning is fairly consistent with the land use. We are in the ROL, Research Office and Laboratory zoning district, which interestingly also goes across Parsippany Road to include some areas which are actually residential in nature, and also the Governor Livingston Park here. It's all within the ROL district. Otherwise, you have commercial zoning in place. You have a B3 district here on Parsippany Road. On the eastern side, on the western side is your office service district. Both of those are neighborhood commercial districts. In terms of residential, over here in the Lake Parsippany neighborhood, it's R4, and then a slightly lower density R3 is found elsewhere in the immediate area. So looking at the requirements of the ROL district, the main permitted uses really are office related. You could have some pharmaceutical production related uses also in place. Accessory uses are basically incidental and supportive of those uses, childcare, indoor health facilities, and also one conditional use, which is hotels. in the RL district. I'm not going to go through all of the area and bulk requirements. The bottom line is that this site is consistent with the requirements of the RL zoning, really in all except for one factor, which is there's a buffer requirement that is a requirement in the RL district of 150 feet to buffer that district from any single-family residential zones. Here we have about 50 or 60 feet. I think that it probably predates that zoning provision. Was probably put in place after this property was developed. Just looking at the existing building context, you can see that there are 9 buildings, and they're connected by an internal loop road that accesses through one point of ingress and egress off of Parsippany Road. This is the IBEW building, which is adjacent but not included in this property. And then there's the Chase Bank here. There are basically 3 clusters of buildings. There's a group of 3 here, and then the 2 to the north part of the site. And these were the properties that were under different ownership until fairly recently. There's about 1,600 surface parking spaces that provide parking for the entire site. And it's basically a collection of 2 to 4 story buildings. 800 and 900 Lanedex Plaza, which is the northern part of the property, those are 4-story buildings. All of the rest are either 2 or 3. So a big part of the study was to really get a sense of what the conditions are on the entire site and also in the individual buildings. So we did take 2 different site visits, one more in the winter and one later in the spring, to get a sense of the overall condition of the property. Went in every single building. I can't say that I went on every single floor of all 9 buildings, but I did go in every single building to get a sense of what's really happening. So just to go through some of the key conditions. Looking at parking, as I said, there's about 1,600 surface parking spaces. The conditions vary, but you can see here that there's a lot of issues with pavement, drainage. I often saw ponding, regardless of whether there had recently been rain. I think the drainage is probably not up to current regulatory standards. You can see here that the curbing, there's almost no contrast between the pavement and the curbing. That's an indication that, like a roof that you continue to replace over time when you reach the point where you have to just rip the whole thing off. We've probably reached that point here with the parking lots. They really just need to rip them up and remill and repave them. There's fairly minimal landscaping in the parking lots. And in terms of signage, there's an overall lack of monument signage. There's certainly a lack of individual building signage, letting you know which tenants are in which building. And some of the signs are not in the best condition. You can see there's some deterioration here. I will say the buildings all look the same. It's kind of hard to find your way around, so wayfinding signage is certainly lacking as well. Landscaping, this picture I wanted to include because the overall effect is a positive one. The landscaping is fairly well maintained. They have a service who clearly comes in and mows and prunes, and the overall impression is a good one, particularly around the building entrances. But when you look at some of the individual elements, there is evidence of paving issues, particularly when you look at sidewalks. Lighting is fairly inconsistent. Some of the lighting has been recently replaced with LED, but overall the lighting is, if not original to the complex, it's fairly old and not inconsistent with modern standards. And it's certainly not consistent across the site. In terms of site amenities, Councilman DePiero could certainly testify of the planning board's experience. We've been seeing a lot of owners of office complexes come in with some upgrades to their facilities. They're providing things like outdoor patios, cafes, all kinds of things that are geared toward particularly the millennial office worker. And in this case, the complex is fairly lacking in those types of amenities. There is one cafe, I believe it's in 300 Lanedex Plaza. It can be accessed from the rear as well as the interior of the building. It's fairly small. It's basically one room with the buffet. And that's basically it in terms of the amenities on the site. There is a single conference room that serves the entire complex. It's also in 300 Lanedex Plaza. In terms of outdoor amenities, there are some fountains and some chairs around those fountains. And you can see this was a fountain that, according to the owner, they had recently, in the last 2 years, painted. It's already showing signs of wear. Some of the chairs and umbrellas are not in the best shape either. And that's the extent of the outdoor amenities. Looking at the building facades, I just wanted to show these are just some typical shots of 2- and 3-story buildings. You can see that the windows they're fairly thin, and they're not perhaps the most energy efficient. It was cold pretty much every time I went there. And they are in need, the building's skin and the facades and the windows are pretty much in need of a universal replacement. You can see here, this was happening the second time I went. They were doing some work on the facade of this building to seal it because they'd had some emergency leakage that was happening and damaging some of the interior areas, so they were having to do some work while I was there. HVAC is probably the most critical issue here on the property. Except for 2 of the buildings, which are gas-powered, all of the rest of the complex is on electricity, electrical, heat, and air. And that's primarily done through these heat pumps, which are around the periphery of all the buildings. There are hundreds of them in these buildings. And you can see this one here is an original one. Others have been covered to try to make them more attractive. But that is a big issue, both in terms of efficiency and also it takes up space in these offices. So that's an issue that the building owner reports has been ongoing when they've tried to find tenants for these spaces. The bathrooms are a bit of a hodgepodge. Some of them have been updated and are in decent shape. Others are fairly original. Most of them are not handicap accessible, and most of them are in need of a full gut renovation. They're not ADA bathrooms on every floor, so that's certainly not in keeping with current standards. The lobbies and the elevators also vary. You can see some of them. I believe this is 800 Landed X Plaza, this one right here, and it's the same lobby here. They've been updated and they're in pretty good shape. They're probably consistent with what most people expect when they come into an office building, either as a tenant or a user. Others are fairly basic. This is probably a 90s type of decor, and here too. This is interesting, the wall that you can see here. It's this sort of decorative stone, and the owner reported that when they tried to take it away, try to blast it off basically or remove it, it was found to be structural in every one of the buildings, so you can't really remove it. It's on the elevator shaft, so in some buildings it's been clad with a more modern appearance, but that is something that they're dealing with in every building that would have to be addressed. Looking at the building interiors, you have footprints. I think the largest building footprint is about 22,000 square feet, and 2 of the buildings are right around that size. All the others are smaller, so you're dealing with fairly small footprints in comparison with some of the other office complexes here in Parsippany and the region. And you can see in some cases they've opened up the floors. This is one where they had pretty much gutted it in preparation to show a potential tenant, what was possible. Here you can see they've actually removed the heat pumps along the perimeter. In other cases they remained. Many of the interior spaces were more chopped up with interior hallways and smaller offices. It really varied depending on who the tenant had been most recently and who the tenants currently were. Looking at the building occupancy, these numbers came from the building owner and it's based on leasing information. They actually provided more detailed leasing information that they wish to keep private because it is proprietary. But the overall building occupancy rate, or the vacancy rate, excuse me, at the time of the study was about 55% across the campus. However, one of these buildings, 700 Landed X, at the time of our study was shown, based on the numbers provided by the owner, that was shown as being fully occupied. Shortly after the study, apparently one of their tenants left, so that is no longer the case. So the overall vacancy rate has certainly increased. There is one building which is entirely vacant, 500 Landed X, and has been for some time. The other buildings really range in occupancy. There's kind of all over the gamut, and it really is based on the particulars of each building. So we reviewed about 10 or 11 years of zoning permit data from the zoning department downstairs. We wanted to try to capture a period that was reflective of the recession as well as reflective of the change in ownership when the property came under common ownership. And basically what the zoning permits tell us is anytime there's a change in tenancy where there are improvements that are being made, they have to obviously get a building permit. So that is sort of tracked in the department. And some key takeaways from this is that the activity has been very sporadic. There were some years where there was a fair amount of activity. There were other years where there was almost no activity in terms of building improvements. And most of that activity was involving fairly small leased areas. In fact, there were only, I think, 4 permits that involved 10,000 square feet or more, and one of those was actually a reduction in space. So even when a tenant is reducing space and that results in some kind of a change or improvement, that will come into play as well. And another key takeaway was that about half, almost half of all the zoning permit activity was focused on 800 and 900 Landindex Plaza. So you see there's some sort of uneven activity and improvements happening across the complex. So one of the things that you have to do with all of this information is then you have to apply the conditions data, the assessment that you've done against the statutory criteria that the local redevelopment and housing law provides. And there are 8 criteria. I'm going to try not to read these. They're not all applicable, but some are, as you'll see. And the first one really deals with sort of the overall site, the overall sense of the condition of the site and the generality of the site and the buildings. That there is some level of them being substandard, unsanitary and safe, obsolete. There's something, lack of light, air, and open space that's really impacting the public health and safety or just general public welfare. Second one deals with buildings that have somehow been either vacated, abandoned, or they're in such a level of disrepair that they cannot be tenanted. Third one deals with public land that has remained vacant for a long period of time due to some particular element of the property. Last one deals with, different from A. A is sort of the generality, the overall sense of the site. D deals with specific areas of the site, specific buildings that are also showing some kind of dilapidation, some kind of obsolescence that really makes it almost impossible for them to be revitalized on their own. The next one deals with issues of title or ownership that is somehow impeding development of the property. Next one deals with properties that have been severely damaged by natural disaster. Next one is only in areas, municipalities where there's an urban enterprise zone established. That's not applicable here. And then the last one is the most recent addition to this list of criteria. It's that if you designate the site as an area in need of redevelopment, it would be consistent with smart growth planning principles that the state has established. So in reviewing these criteria, we found that there are 3 that are relevant to this site and this property. The first 2 kind of go hand in hand. One deals with, again, the generality of the site. The overall condition of the site is substandard in some way, obsolete. And the next one deals with particular elements of the site or particular buildings. And then the third one is that smart growth planning principles criteria. And again, that's a new one, and it's supposed to be based on smart growth principles that the state has established. However, the state has not established those principles. It's recommended practice for planners not to sort of hang your hat on this criteria, but to use it in conjunction with others. There have been some smart growth planning principles established by different state agencies, and in particular, Parsippany has been designated in a growth area. So because of that designation, we feel that looking at redevelopment here would be consistent with smart growth. It is near established centers of development. It is somewhat near transit, and you're not dealing with a completely rural, undeveloped area. So we think that that criteria does apply. So I'll just go back. When we were looking at applying these criteria and you know, whether the site meets them or not, it's fairly narrow, as you may get a sense. It basically, does it or does it not meet the criteria? And so we reviewed our sense of the condition of the buildings and the site. We reviewed the market study prepared by the Otto Group and the condition study prepared by the Kimmerly Group. The Otto study really did summarize, I think, what a lot of the information that we all know, the weakness of the Parsippany market in particular, remaining weaker than the county and the state overall. There is a high degree of vacancy, and while there has been some activity in terms of leasing, we found is that a lot of that is moving from one area of the township to another, or one area of Morris County to another. So it's a little bit like robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's still not getting that overall vacancy rate down significantly, so that remains an issue. And the auto group also looked at some of the leasing rates based on recent activity here in Parsippany, and they found that they're still fairly low. I believe the average selling price that they found for comparable office properties was about 120 a square foot. And then we contrast that with the Kimberly report. Those are the architects that looked really in detail at the building condition and the costs to rehab. They came up with an overall number of $339 a square foot. Now, as I said to the planning board, we can quibble a little bit about that number. It was kind of all in. That includes things like parking decks, things that may or may not be absolutely required, but certainly a lot of it is required. And when you look at some of the details of those costs, just replacing the heat pumps, which, as I said, there are hundreds of them, the estimate there is $16 million just for the heat pumps. Replacing the building skins and windows was about $10 million. So those are some really high cost items. Clearly would need to be done to attract tenants to make this a marketable property. So even if that $339 a square foot comes down a bit, that's still a huge gap when you're looking at the selling prices that could be obtained. So we think that really speaks very highly to the fact that this is a property that probably cannot on its own revitalize and rehab and be competitive in the office market. It certainly speaks to the obsolescence of these buildings and just how much work is needed to make them be competitive. There's clearly some deferred maintenance as well, if we're being honest, and I think that was very evident in some of those pictures. But not all of it is deferred maintenance. Some of it is just underlying building conditions that buildings were built in the late 70s, early 80s, and they're just not really up to speed here. So we think that A and D, those two criteria are clearly met here, both when you look at the site overall, the lack of amenities that it has, how hard it would be to add those amenities. I talked about the small building footprints. One of there are kind of two factors there. One is that if you have such small footprints, you're only attracting kind of smaller users, and that tends to be people who may not be as solid as some of your larger corporations. So you're going to have more turnover, most likely. The second big factor of the small footprints is it's really hard to put amenity space in those areas because every amount of space that you're putting toward amenities is taking away leasable space, which you already don't have a ton of. There have been other office complexes in town who have been successful, we think, at adding amenity space by doing things like connecting buildings to create entirely new space. Just because of the configuration that you have here and the distance of the buildings from each other, the fact that you need basically all of the parking that's provided is going to be needed, you really couldn't do that kind of conversion. It would be very difficult and extraordinarily expensive. So it's just, again, very difficult to think about bringing this property up to standards without enormous expenditure of capital. The building owner actually was at the planning board hearing and did provide information about the investments that they've taken when they took ownership of the property, and I remember the councilman was very interested in that. They did put I think about $3 million into the property when they first bought it. They were able to get some of the vacancy down, particularly in 800 and 900, and then they lost people anyway, and it came right back down to where it had been. And I think that really said to them, and I tend to agree, that it's kind of a losing proposition. They can keep throwing money at it, but it's probably not going to change the underlying issues with the property as well as the market itself. So again, we think all of these factors lead to A&D, the issues of obsolescence and the overall building conditions and property conditions really making revitalization on its own almost impossible. It is, we think, consistent with smart growth planning principles. Again, we wouldn't hang our hat on that whole criteria alone, but we think in combination with the other two, revitalizing this property, it's in basically the central part of Parsippany along a major commercial corridor, has the potential to improve conditions on the overall commercial areas. So we think that is consistent with smart growth. So that was our conclusion, that it does meet the statutory criteria designation. As I said to the planning board, it's a fairly narrow decision that they had under their purview. Does it or does not meet the criteria? They were not making a judgment call on whether it should be a redevelopment plan should be developed, or how the development should happen, how revitalization should occur, what are the standards and uses. All of that would be subject to your decision tonight, as well as preparation of a redevelopment plan. So they were not making those kind of decisions. But basically, as a result of the study and deliberation that the planning board undertook, they did concur with this meeting the statutory criteria, and they have made a recommendation to you that it be designated as an area in need of redevelopment. We did talk about some other options that are available to you as the governing body. They were not available to the planning board. The planning board's direction from you was again narrow, and it was only to consider redevelopment. But there are other options that we did talk about in the report. One of them is designation as an area in need of rehabilitation. It's contained under the same law, and it's similar in terms of the criteria, a little bit easier to meet than a redevelopment designation. Primary differences here are that if an area in need of rehab cannot use pilot or other long-term financing, like bond financing. Short-term abatements and financing are okay and eligible under rehab, but not anything long-term. So that's a key difference. You also cannot use condemnation as part of a rehab study. Again, that's not on the table here. So otherwise, a lot of the benefits that a property owner would find under redevelopment designation are also in place for rehab. We also looked at whether the property could be rezoned. There is no zone that exists in Parsippany that would basically allow the type of mixed-use development that the owner is looking for. However, there are under the state statutes, state laws, provisions for planned development, planned unit development, and that is something that the township has undertaken in the past, mostly in a residential context. You do have a few PUD zones that have been designated and developed. So that's something, that's a tool that's at your disposal. The property owner would be free to request that. There would have to be a process to essentially create a zone. There'd be a planning process with that as well. Overlay zoning it is something that's kind of already on the table in the Housing and Fair Share Plan that was adopted last night by the Planning Board. A portion of this property is contained within an overlay zone that has been designated in that housing plan for essentially that would cover, I think, the first phase of the applicant's desired development. The details of that overlay zone are being worked on and will be coming to you in the next probably 10 days because we're all under a clock here. As you all know, to get the compliance mechanisms and the zoning for the affordable housing done. So that is already happening. The overlay zoning will be in place at some point in the near future. It could always be adjusted later to encompass more of the site, encompass later phases of development as well. Again, that would be your decision. And the last is there's always an option that the applicant could seek a use variance from the Zoning Board of Appeals. Probably not the preferable option when you look at any type of major development, but that is also always an option on the table. We just wanted to make sure we were covering the different alternatives that are available to the property owner other than redevelopment. Any of them are really under your purview, with the exception of the zoning use variance, which would be before the zoning board. And most of them would involve some type of public process, some type of additional study or research. So those are all on the table. And I believe that covers it. I hope I didn't go too fast. Open to questions or comments.
Comment, if I may?
Yes.
Since I have a slight advantage, I am on the planning board, and I was there to question the applicant. Councilwoman Graniani and I attended 2 ribbon cutting ceremonies at 900 Lanedex, and the building was in good condition, and there were 2 medical facilities that moved in there. And so my question to the owners was, why can't you do this with the other buildings? And their answer to me caused me to think, he said, we put a lot of money into these 2 buildings, 800 and 900, there's a 900 Lanedex. We put a lot of money to upgrade them and make them attractive to rent. He says, despite all the money that we spent, we're less than 43% occupied in both buildings. That's a very poor return for a very large investment. And so then that convinced me that just renovating the buildings was really not the answer.
Yeah, Councilman, I had the same thought when I first started the study and I was looking at those 2 buildings. They clearly were in better shape. Had been, there'd been investments made. They were more modern, and I was thinking, do they belong with the rest of the site? Maybe we only do redevelopment on the rest of the site. But it really, the more I got into it and saw the data for one thing, but also just in general, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to think of them as two separate parcels, even though they are. They function as a single complex. There's only one way in, one way out for the entire complex. And you do have the ability under the state statute to consider an overall area in which not every individual building or piece of the property is in a state of dilapidation or obsolescence, but collectively they really need to be considered as a unified piece. I will say that based on the data that the councilman was just noting, I do think that those two buildings, even though they have seen investment, remain obsolete in the generality. They have a lot of the same issues that the other buildings do. Some of those heat pumps still remain in those buildings. They're not gas powered. And I think you see that come into play when you look at those vacancy numbers.
So it's fair to say that there are 10 buildings on site?
They're 9.
9 buildings. So each of the 9 by itself would fit one or both of the primary criteria?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
As well as the site as a whole?
Right. The one building that had the highest level of occupancy, that is almost exclusively a result of King's being
That was
their
one
largest
client
tenant.
who was going to leave.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I read in the report that it would take approximately, correct me if I'm wrong, I may get this wrong, it's $148 million that would have to be invested in the property for them to get a return on their investment.
Right, that was the number that came from the applicant. And as I said, we could agree to disagree on some of those items. I'm not convinced that you need as many parking garages. I think they had 2 there. That could bring that number down. But as I said, there are investments that I think would have to be made just to bring them up to standards to be competitive with the rest of the marketplace. I don't know what the overall number is, but it's certainly very high, and it's not anywhere near the amount that they could get.
And it included infrastructure as well,
Yes.
because the sewer and the drainage
Drainage, it was
doesn't meet
roof
standards.
replacement, it was all in. It was, HVAC, ADA accessibility, bathrooms, all, interior, exterior. It was a very detailed look at what they felt would be required to really bring that full site up to par.
There was also a comment in there about taking 15 years to actually occupy the buildings. That's the time frame. Was that overall in Parsippany, or was that?
I think it wasn't just on the site. I think that was either in the Parsippany market or the Morris County market. I don't remember exactly which one that referred to. That was from the Otto report, but that was the figure that it would take 15 years to bring that vacancy rate back down and occupy the office
Right, so you're talking about 148 million, waiting for a return on investment for 15 years?
Right. Well, when the rest of the market is also seeing, heavy
Right.
vacancies.
Right, yeah. The question about the buffer, you said there was 150, required
Right.
was 150
Right.
feet, and this has 60. How do you resolve that?
Well, I mean, that could certainly be resolved in a future development in the property. That does create a bit of an opportunity to increase that distance from the residential area. And I actually drove in some of those streets in that neighborhood off of Green Hill Road. And even when the leaves are all in the trees, you can still see the parking lot, through those edges of the streets and the back of those properties. So there's certainly an opportunity to improve that condition and improve the conditions of all that impervious surface. There's room for improvement, certainly.
Yeah. And maybe you could just explain or explain to me again. We were talking about rehabilitation versus redevelopment.
Yes.
And they have different requirements associated with them as far as tax abatements and.
Right. The council may jump in, but I know that the big difference, aside from condemnation, which is not really relevant here, that was always a non-condemnation study. The big difference is in terms of the long-term tax abatements, like pilots and RAB financing.
Under redevelopment.
Under redevelopment, those are tools that can be used. Under rehabilitation, they're not.
Right, so the statutory criteria for designation of a property in need of rehabilitation is less burdensome than it is under the redevelopment designation, which is essentially a blight designation, right? You get the same redevelopment toolbox in a rehabilitation designation, except that, as Susan notes, there you cannot use long-term tax abatement, all right, and you cannot use eminent domain. Now, this study had always contemplated that there would be no eminent domain because